like to very much introduce to the stage Sheldon Stopsack. Sheldon is the Visual Effects Supervisor at MPC. His wide experience includes VFX Supervisor at MPSC on Terminator Genesis. MPC completed more than 200 shots for Terminator Genesis, working closely with production VFX Supervisor Yannick Sears and VFX producer Sherry Hansen. The team's work included recreating the stunning photoreal young Arnold, the T-800 digital character, endoskeletons, and explosive battle at LAX, various CG set extensions and FX work. Sheldon, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, Julian. Hi. Hello, everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the Academy for having me here today. It's really great to have the opportunity to present what ACES brings to the table for visual effects. So today's talk, a little bit of an agenda, how it breaks down. We're going to cover three components, basically, and it sort of represents a little bit of history for ACES usage at MPC, which sort of started back in 2013 in an actual production environment. So the first thing we're going to look at is a show which is called The Lone Ranger, which some of you may have seen or not seen, which was MPC's first full ACES show where we fully implemented ACES into our pipeline from front to end. Then we're going to take a look at the sort of second generation shows, as I would call it, where we used also ACES, but in a sort of reduced capacity. And then last but not least, we're going to look at basically where we stand today with ACES and ACES 1.0, and yeah, the current sort of state of usage of ACES within MPC. So, Lone Ranger, the first full ACES show for us, and it was a bit of a sort of jump into the deep end, I would say. But let me go quickly to the motivation why we actually looked into ACES and the adaptation of or usage of ACES within our pipeline for this show. ACES, or Lone Ranger, was basically shot on various camera inputs. So we knew up front that we had to deal with different material that was coming in from our clients. It was partially shot on the ARRI Alexa as a digital sort of media that came to us, mostly used for night shots, but also we received some classical film footage, basically, film scans. And the motivation behind that is, obviously, with those different inputs, that we wanted to unify our color process, and we wanted to ensure that our workflow and the color pipeline effectively is as slick and as simple as possible. The main benefit there, obviously, having a simplified user workflow and an interface, and it's less confusing than having, various color pipelines run in parallel. And last but not least, it was just fancy and new, and we were keen on, looking into it, what it could bring to the table. So let's look a little bit at the workflow, basically. So commonly at the onset data here on the left, basically, like I said, it was ARRI Alexa and film footage. It would come to us basically delivered. At the ingest process, we converted this material into ACES, sort of unified it, and then we did, in this black box, magic of visual effects, we did our work. And once we were done with that, we basically sent this work back and inverted basically the process. So we had a transform at the ingest and at the send process from various materials into ACES. But we also obviously had to deal with other image material that was coming to us, and there was actually a nice side effect there. Best example is like digital DSLR materials, like for texture, data acquisition, or HDI data that would come to us. And at that point, we obviously wanted to take the benefit of it, of unifying everything, and converted this material into ACES as well, bringing it all into this one world, into this one standard, which was basically a huge advantage here because we found ourselves in a very unified and controlled environment. These are just a couple of example images from photo texture reference that were taken of different actors and props, and also the Scorpion. And the benefit there, as soon as you kind of find yourself in a unified sort of color environment, and your color pipeline is basically very sort of simplistic in that sense, the advantage basically being that you are much more controlled about your work. And your work basically at that point, kind of falls into place a lot quicker and a lot easier, and it requires a lot less artist interpretation to sort of compensate for certain mismatches and grading. And the Scorpion here is just being one example where our data acquisition for the textures obviously was controlled. It was done in ACES, and then the look development was basically falling into place relatively quickly as far as it concerns the color work that we had to do. And then, like I said, our plates were already sort of converted, and we found ourselves in the same world, and these things fell into place a lot quicker and a lot easier, which is beneficial for various reasons. I guess, obviously it has an economical impact. You're much faster with the work that you can do, but you can also put your energy more in the creative process, which was, the huge advantage here. So a little bit of a quick summary on Lone Ranger. So we successfully implemented ACES into our workflow. So that was a huge success for us there. It worked really well. We simplified our user workflow and interface. It means like we really took away all of these artist interpretation of like using different LUTs or having to think about like what material they were working with. On the back of that, we pretty much conformed all of our texture and HDRI library into ACES. So all the basically shows that were sort of coming afterwards were utilizing ACES at that point already. So that was pretty much made our standard there. Main motivation there to really remain show agnostic for any of the data that we create or would reuse on various occasions, let it be HDRI or textures. But we still required some color transform for the ingest and the send process, and that wasn't necessarily ideal for us. Also at the time in 2013, we basically were still, dealing with the pre-release of ACES. ACES wasn't quite fully fleshed out, and we were still a bit away from the 1.0 release. So that was our first experience, but let's have a quick look a little bit at the second generation ACES show, because like I said, there were still sort of certain bumps that we had to iron out, the transform and the ingest and the send being one of them. So we basically started looking at like, sort of different methods of using ACES, and those kind of broke down into two flavors, I'd say, flavor 1 and flavor 2. I just took these two as an example. On the left, it's Maleficent, which was run in a certain way, and on the right, more recently, but it was Terminator, which also made use of ACES, but in a different capacity. So let's have a look at the two different scenarios. Flavor 1, the Maleficent example. Now we're looking a little bit into this black box of visual effects. What we decided there as a test, sort of basically utilize ACES more on the textual side of things. Like I said, all of our library had been converted. But we also wanted to use ACES for lighting and respectively look development. Again, the main motivation there to say, like, okay, listen, all of this stuff, should remain show agnostic. That shouldn't be tied to, a color or a gamut that, is dictated by the plate. So we wanted to keep that as ACES, basically. So we reduced it to this little area. Now, conceptually, this is fine, and I guess that's the reason why we tested this, but you still introduce like conversion steps, basically. You still, your final renders still need to be converted into the respective, plate gamut, in this case, ARRI Alexa. But, you kind of convert it basically when you hand it off to environments and DMP, but you also convert it when you do it to the handover to the compositing team. Now, the problem there is like, this is not a linear workflow. This stuff needs to go back and forth, and materials being handed, back and forth, basically, between those departments. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to keep track of, like, what am I actually looking at? Is it ACES now, or is it ARRI already? Not entirely sure. And lastly, it's also not necessarily, it's workable, like I said, but it's not necessarily intuitive. So this is, just a drop-down menu for like various slots that we had installed on Maleficent, and you don't really want to have artists to necessarily interpret that and know already at any time really what is good for them to use. So that wasn't necessarily the most ideal scenario. Flavor 2 was, even more simplified, I'd say, and we sort of reduced a little bit of a usage of ACES into the texturing corner to remain show agnostic, the benefit still being there. We said, like, okay, listen, lighting is going to work also in the show gamut, basically, ARRI Alexa in that case. It's great, but you still have a conversion step at that level, and wherever you do transform and a conversion, I guess it's not really ideal. So again, it's workable, but it's not quite there yet. So it still requires a little bit of artist interpretation, and it's really not necessarily the best solution for us. So brief summary for the second generation ACES shows that we had. We still basically compromised the benefit of ACES as a unified color space. So that certainly wasn't desirable. We introduced color transforms at various stages. It was a little less sensitive, and we got away with a lot more, but it's still not really ideal. And lastly, really, you require various LUTs and, artist interpretation to make the right decision for you. So it's really, not necessarily simplified at that point. And at that time, when we really run these shows, not necessarily Terminator, ACES was still under development, so there was still a lot of stuff going on. Which kind of leads a little bit to where we stand today in a way. And like we already heard just now, ACES 1.0 was basically introduced and released in December 2014. And things got a little bit more interesting at that point. So where do we stand today with this? ACES was released, but more interestingly, ACES also came with what was interesting for the visual effects companies. Basically, it introduced various other gamuts, and ACES CG being the most interesting one for us there. So at the same time, what started to happen, and I think we saw that in the audience here, there was a lot more awareness, and a lot more people started talking about ACES and sort of started considering using it to various capacities. And this obviously helps us because, as long as everyone within the visual effects industry, but also outside is sort of, using ACES, these conversion steps obviously become redundant and we don't really have to deal with them anymore, which is great. But let's quickly look at the benefit of ACES CG. One thing that we kind of found out over time is that, rendering in ACES, and I'm not talking about ACES CG, but in the really wide gamut that we saw on this little chart earlier, it's not necessarily, let's say, reliable for your computational computer graphics elements that you create. And the main item that we sort of found out over the time that we did these sort of experience and these tests and these shows is that we deal with like really sort of unpredicted indirect illumination and weak reflectance values. I'm going to show like a little example where it kind of comes into play. If you look a little bit at this red chrome sphere on the top left, this is currently rendered with ACES, but if you see, I'm going to flick between two. ACES CG basically preserves a lot more energy effectively, and it's a much more accurate representation of energy preserving computation of like indirect illumination or indirect diffuse and specular. So that being a huge advantage, having ACES CG being really sort of such a reliable and workable sort of gamut for us, which was sort of the missing piece for us effectively. So where do we stand today? Like I said, a lot more companies outside of the visual effects world adapt ACES. So the onset side is being sort of ported to ACES, which is great. And DI is starting to make use a lot more of ACES. So really these sort of transforms effectively kind of go away at that point, and we are in the benefit of like having a really unified ACES workflow from front to end, not just in visual effects. Lastly, like I said, it's a CG-friendly color behavior now, so really sort of the issues that we kind of found out over time, they're being basically sort of solved for us, and it's of great use. Standardized screen representation, obviously a huge benefit. Everyone is seeing the same picture, especially if you deal with clients. Visual effects is such a color-sensitive sort of work and environment that you find yourself, and you want to make sure that everyone is seeing the same picture in the same way, that you have the same conversation and the same judgment. So where do we stand today? At the moment, at MPC, we have like two larger productions that are, fully in ACES, fully ACES turnover. It's King Arthur and Miss P. It's a rather long name, so I'm not going to read it out loud, which is a Tim Burton movie. All productions have moved to ACES CG for the textual side of things and our HDIs. That is still up to date, really the standard, to remain show agnostic. And MPC as a company really encourages to use ACES throughout the entire pipeline for the onset side as well as the DI, because we see the huge benefit of like having the unified sort of color management across the whole process. That was it really. Thank you very much.